Hello, welcome back. Good evening. I'm sorry that I'm saying good evening, but I think that because I'm recording in the evening. So I always wish you having amazing time whenever you are watching this video or lecture. So today's session will be our 10th session together, lesson number 10. As you do remember, this will be the second part of talking about political thinkers. We talked about part of it in session 9, and today we're going to complete talking about some core thinkers who were the most important figures in shaping political science. So, our first thinker for this lecture will be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. As usual, we have one core question, which is why do we need to study Jean-Jacques Rousseau? We're going to seek to identify the competencies and the components of his philosophy, particularly the idea of general will. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Francophone Genevian philosopher and writer whose conceptualization of social contract, the theory of natural human, and works on education greatly influenced the political, philosophical, and social Western tradition. In other words, he was one of those thinkers who shaped the general form of Western tradition, who participated and described and formed the track socially, politically of that era. Whenever we're going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, definitely we need to talk about the theory of natural human. In common with other philosophers who discussed this idea, Rousseau looked at the hypothetical state of natural as normative guide. Contrary to Hobbes, if you do remember, Hobbes' view, Rousseau held that uncorrupted morals prevail in the state of nature. Let's remember together for a second. Hobbes assumed that people are bad in nature and they will tend to fight each other, while Rousseau had a different point of view. He believed that the state of nature is a state of moral. It will be uncorrupted morals state of nature. In this discourse, the origins of inequality among men is one of the most famous books that Rousseau wrote, in which he maintained that man in a state of nature had been a celebrity, ape-like creature who was not bad. As Hobbes, he maintained, but like some other animals, if we can use the term, but actually that's the term they used, had an innate tendency to see others of his kind suffer. Rousseau asserted that the stage of human development associated with what he called savages was the best or optimal in human development between the less than optimal extreme of brute animals on the one hand, and on the other hand, the extreme of decadent civilization. These two ideas a little bit confusing. We're not gonna talk more in this, but my advice to you is read articles about his thoughts. He, as any other philosophers, were trying to build an accumulative efforts based on other thinkers who discussed this idea. So, in some point, you will see reflection of other philosophers, and others you will see no, he had something about the theory of natural or the theory of nature or natural human. Now we get to talk about the social contract. As we said before, social contract was one of the most controversial, interesting topic that all the Enlightenment thinkers talked about. The social contract, according to Rousseau, outlines the basis for a legitimate political order, within a framework of classical republicanism. Um, uh, he published a book in 1762, which became later one of the most influential works of political philosophy in the Western tradition. Rousseau claimed that the state of nature was a primitive condition without law or morality, which human beings left for the benefit and necessity of cooperation. As society developed, division of labor and private property required the human race to adopt institutions of law and new social political structure. In this sense, he described the social contract as something different, as a kind of awareness that human beings gain by themselves, actually. Okay, according to Rousseau, by joining together into civil society through the social contract and abandoning their claims of natural rights, individuals can both preserve themselves and remain free. This is because submission to the authority of the general will of people, of all other citizens as a whole, guarantees individuals against being subordinated to the wills of others, and also ensures that they obey themselves because they are um, collectively the authors of the law. The idea of general will donated the will of the people as a whole. It served to design to form the common interest embodied in legal tradition, as distinct from other forms, people's private and particular interests at any particular time. Okay, let's have a look on this or this idea particularly. Rousseau was having a new advanced look towards human beings. He thought that people are more mature, are more aware towards their interests, towards their partners in the community. It's the opposite of the previous Enlightenment thinkers, um, who thought that people will go for the contract because they are afraid. Rousseau was talking that people will go for this contract because they are aware. And this is a very important and interesting point. If we go back for the previous thinkers, they didn't treat human beings as mature and self-aware creatures. They treated them as creatures who are controlled by instincts and fear. While Rousseau raised the level of analyzing to deal with the humans as creatures who can use their minds to determine what is the best for themselves and their communities. And this is the new point, actually. It's not about self-interest, it's more about the community as a whole. And this is the most important point about Rousseau's idea and the social contract. Although Rousseau argues that sovereignty or the power to make the laws, as he called it, should be in the hands of the people, he also makes a sharp distinction between the sovereignty and the government. Um, he made a clear space or a clear definition between sovereign and the government. Rousseau posits that the political aspects of a society should be divided into two parts. First, there must be a sovereign consisting of the whole population, especially women. And this is a very important point that we're going to go back later on. That represents the general will and is the legislative power within the state, while the second division is that of the government, being distinct from the sovereign. The division is necessary because the sovereign can deal with the particular matters like applications of the law, for example, problems, etc. Doing so would undermine it generally in a clear way to distinguish between the idea of sovereign and power. Doing so also would undermine its generality and therefore damage its legitimacy. Thus, government must remain a separate institution from the sovereign body. When the government exceeds the boundaries set in place by the people, it is the mission of the people to abolish such government and begin a new one. This is a very interesting point and idea because it's actually the core root for the current democracy that everyone is seeking for. It's not only gave the root of democracy in its simple shape, it's also refused to exclude women, and that was the first time we can see a thinker who is demanding to include women in the political life, and this is very important. From this point, we start to have a clear separation between powers and authorities. That's why Rousseau is one of the most important thinkers who started to talk about the separation between powers and authorities. Rousseau's philosophy of education is one of the most interesting participation that he did. He wasn't only a philosopher who participated in political science or social science. No, he had a very interesting theory in education. Let's talk a little bit about. His philosophy of education elaborated in his 1762 book who called Emily or on education. His book or his theory concerns itself with developing the student's character and moral sense so that they may learn to practice self-mastery and remain very individually aware. He assumed that students must remain virtuous even in the unnatural and imperfect society in which they will have to live. That hypothesis he put in his book is to be raised in the countryside, which Rousseau believes is a more natural and healthy environment than the city. Under that hypothesis, we can have a lot of questions actually. One important question we can raise is the relation between the student and the tutor or the teacher. He assumed that the teacher must or will guide his students through learning experiences arranged previously. And this is a little bit interesting because other thinkers see education as something to give. It's not something to learn by themselves. He assumed that students will learn things through experiences, and that was the most interesting part. Rousseau also felt that children learn right and wrong through experiences and through certain acts they do rather than through physical punishment. Um, in his point of view, the teacher will make sure that no harm results through his learning experience with the students. Rousseau became an early advocate of the new modern education methodologies that we see today. He refused the idea of punishment. He was asking whether punishment is a way to forbid people from learning, or were there any important tools to induce students to learn a way of punishment and fear? And remember, he refused the idea of fear even when he talked about the social contract. Uh, the idea of education theory reflected exactly his mentality even when he talked about political principles actually. So why we talked about education theory? Because we want to know more how he see human beings, why he was different from other thinkers, and I hope this answered you. Uh, it's a little bit confusing because he was trying to give her a role, but he was controlled maybe with other stereotypes and other thinkers that he was like, in a certain point, he wants women to be there, but at the same time, he cannot put them in a higher. Uh, let's talk about certain key elements about Rousseau. As we talked before, he is one of the most important philosophers who influenced the Enlightenment, especially in France and Europe. It was also important figure in the French Revolution and the overall development of modern political and educational thought in many countries. His participation and contribution and theories on education and politics at certain point formed the seed for other thinkers to proceed and produce better theories. In common with other philosophers, Rousseau looked at the hypothesis of state of nature as a normative guide. Again, in his book and literature, he maintained the states of a human development associated with what he called savage, as we mentioned before, but he was trying always to put men in a better condition, to raise the level of awareness of human beings. And he was considering the community and the human beings as very dynamic creatures. And he was concentrating on the process of development because it is the role element that controlled everything in his discourse or book on the moral effects of the arts and science. Rousseau argued and positioned to the dominant stand of Enlightenment thinkers that the arts and science corrupt human morality. Another point he was pointed and stressed at about the social contract, as we said. He outlined that the base of legitimate political order within the framework of the state um, is a little bit controlled with people more than government. And as we said, he talked about the separation, and that was one of the most important points. Rousseau also point of view in education concerns itself with the developing of a student's characteristics and personality and moral sense in a way by themselves, only by guiding by certain guiding from the teacher. So he thinks that students will learn to practice self-mastery and be more aware towards themselves and towards the community. And by this way, these students will be more mature citizens, and his point of view in that level, they will adopt the social contract by them. Rousseau was a believer in the moral superiority, as we said, and he put this as a base for classification the community between men and women, between at certain points certain classes, and that was a little bit confusing for certain thinkers who tried to study him. Let's talk about certain terms that we can raise when we talk about Rousseau. We can mention the term noble savage. It's the character, it's actually a literary stock character, which embodies the concept of an idealized um, character or identity, outsider or other who hasn't been corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolizes humanity's innate goodness. In English, the phrase first appeared actually in the 17th century in certain literature, but the concept was more clear with Rousseau because he was trying to make this as a core element in determining the pace of social contract. Also, we have another term, which is the discourse of the origins of inequality among men. Uh, this is a book or a work by by our philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau that first exposes his conceptions and ideas of a human state of nature and human perfection, an early idea of progress. In this, Rousseau explained how, according to him, people may have established civil society, which leads later to present private property as the original source and base of all inequality. So he was trying to point that once people start to have their own private properties, this will lead to inequality definitely. Another term we can talk about is a state of nature, and as we said, he had his point of view about state of nature, a concept used in a moral political philosophy, religious, social contract theories, international law to denote the hypotheses and condition of what the lives of people might have been like before the modern societies. Um, in some versions of social contract theories, there are no rights in the state of nature. It was only freedoms. And there are several forms of the social contract. In other versions, the opposite occurs. For example, the contract imposes restrictions upon individuals that crucial their natural rights. Here, Russell was trying to make a balance between the two opposite ideas. We can also talk about his moral effect of arts and science. We talked about this, but I want just to remind you that in this book, he argued that arts and science corrupt the human morality. And this is an important sentence to remember. Um, Russell's first expression of his influential views about nature versus theory, to which he would dedicate most of his intellectual life, was to try to analyze what could corrupt human being the most. I want to talk about also the idea of general will, a philosophical and political concept that Rousseau cared about. He developed and popularized this idea, and he was talking about the general will as part of the social contracts. According to Rousseau's point of view, general will served to designate the common interest embodied in legal tradition, as distinct from people's private and particular interest at any particular time. Okay, we reached to the puzzle of today. Okay, the puzzle of today is a little bit relevant to the social contract. Actually, I want you to tell me, when was the first election in history ever, and who won that election? Then I want you to tell me why or when actually women started to participate in the political life in general as voters or even as part of the election campaigns. Okay, we reached to talk about our second thinker today, who is John Stuart Mill. Our objective here is to understand Mill's philosophy and Mill's tendencies in translating his thoughts into theory. To understand his point of view as someone who participated in building the shape of political science. Who is Mill? John Stuart Mill was one of the most important intellectual figures of the 19th century. He contributed to economics, politics, logic, philosophy, and he was one of the most important thinkers in that time. His most lasting influence has been through his utilitarian ethics and liberal political philosophy. John Stuart Mill is an English philosopher, political economist, a civil servant, one of the most influential thinkers in the history of classical liberalism. He contributed widely to social theory, political theory, and political economy. We can call him the most influential English philosopher in the 19th century. His conceptions of liberty justified the freedom of individual in opposition to unlimited state and social control. As we did with all our previous thinkers and philosophers, we're going to talk about Mill's point of view in political science, political thoughts, and especially in liberalism. His book on liberty is one of the most important and widely read articulations of liberal philosophy in the history of political thoughts. The single object of the essay, writes Mill, is to assert the principle that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, isn't a sufficient warrant. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. May thus disqualifies other reasons that are often used to justify the interference with individual liberty. The harm principle excludes paternalism or even excludes constraining an individual's freedom for the sake of what one believes to be that individual's own benefit. Instead, Mill argued that each individual should be able to decide what constitutes his or her own good and how he or she will pursue it. Similarly, actions cannot probably be constrained on the grounds that they will cause offense rather than harm to other people. The harm principle for him. Mill states that it's not a crime to harm oneself as long as the person doing so is not harming others. And this is a little bit critical. We're going to talk about this later. He favors the harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any citizen is to stop harming others. He excuses those who are incapable of self-government for this principle, such as young children or those living in backward states in society, or etc. Two important elements to discuss in this sentence is that the harm theory or the harm principle is really a little bit unfair, because even when someone is hurting himself or herself, is still hurting the community, because human beings nowadays are productive units. Each human being, each citizen is part of this community, and hurting yourself will definitely hurt the entire community. Why that wasn't the situation where Mill described it. The other point here is that to count people under two categories, people who can have this self-control or self-government while others can't, is a little bit dangerous classification, because at certain points there will be some people who will say women will not be capable for self-government. Others could say, like, not only children, maybe certain a class of the community will not be able to do the self-government. Especially, he talked about what he called backward states and the society. So this is a little bit confusing and a little bit like freaky, or let's say scary. Although the harm principle seems clear, there are a number of complications. For example, Mill explicitly states that harm principle may include acts of omission as well as acts of commission. Thus, failing to rescue a drowning child counts as a harmful act, for example, as does failing to pay taxes or failing to appear as a witness in court. Uh, all such harmful omissions may be regulated according to Mill. By contrast, it doesn't count as harming someone without force or without um, having the intention of harming. That affected individual consents to assume the risk. Thus, one may permissibly offer unsafe employment to others, or provided there is no deception individual involved. He does, however, recognize one limit to consent. Society should not permit people to sell themselves into slavery, and this is one of the most controversial points. The question of what counts as a self-regarding action and what actions, whether of omission or commission, constitute harmful actions subject to regulation to others or to the community, continue to exercise certain interpretations by Mill. He didn't consider giving, for example, offense as a harm, or couldn't be restricted because it violated the intention or the moral attitude for a certain category. Mill believed that the struggle between liberty and authority is the most problematic figure in the promotion of history. For him, liberty is an measurable thing. He sees liberty as antiquity, which stands between subjects or some classes of subjects and the government on the other hand. Mill defined social liberty as protection from the political rules. He introduced a number of different concepts of forming these rules, where it could take place or reflect itself in the community. And thus, he raised the term tyranny or the social tyranny, and he was talking about the tyranny of the majority against the entire community. The tyranny of majority, in his point of view, was a little bit against the willing of each individual. Again, social liberty for Mill meant putting limits on the rules, on the power, so that each citizen would not be able to use the power, or each one inside the community will not have the ability to use this power to further his or her own wishes, and thus make decisions that could harm others in the community or could harm the community in general. In other words, people should have the right to have a say in the government's decisions on an equal level. He said that social liberty was the nature and limit of the power which can legitimately exercised by society and citizens over the individuals. It was attempted in two ways, actually. First, by obtaining recognition of certain ammutes or certain limits called political liberties or rights. Second, by establishment a system of constitutional checks. Uh, Mill is one of the most controversial thinkers that we might find, because he have a lot of ideas that sometimes they are not very relevant, maybe they are in contrast of each. Okay, let's try to have a nice comparison or conclusion to Mill's ideas with other scholars or philosophies that used to be there during his era. For example, early liberal and utilitarian theories saw human beings as selfish, power seeker, and consumers of wealth. For Mill, on the other hand, the essential value of a human being lay not in the ability to produce or consume more and more in an ever expanding cycle. Human beings were instead now seen as capable of infinite development on all sides through the expanding of innate individual capacities. So the first assumption of Mill's reform of the utilitarian idea of happiness is to introduce and to produce an ambivalence towards the economic model of a human nature associated with capitalism, as well as critical attitude to the imperative of capitalist economics towards infinite expansion of the gross national product. A second conception or consequence is that Mill can no longer easily assume that the individuals are necessarily always the best judges for their own interests. To some extent, but not to the radical extent. As well, we will see when we come to look more closely, for example, at his book on liberty. Mill is prepared to look behind what people say they want. When doing so, Mill begins to sound non-liberal. He begins to sound a bit like Plato, who is quite happy to have a more enlightened and wiser class in society determine the true needs of all other individuals. In the same line, when we do certain comparisons between Mill and other thinkers, in moving from Locke to John Stuart Mill in the development of the liberal tradition and politics, we are overlooking some very important developments. Much in the history of liberalism since the time of Hobbes was a set of important challenges to his special theory. To Hobbes emphasized on the necessity of an absolute sovereign. Later classical liberals, most importantly John Locke, as we've seen, argued for a limited sovereignty and argued in a direction that brought them closer to the idea of popular sovereignty in something like Rousseau's sense of the term. For Locke, at least, some of the people are truly responsible and truly a repository of sovereignty, and their consent in the final court before which governments are to be brought. As we are going to remember together, Locke also argued that the power of the sovereign is inherently limited because individuals in the state of nature were sufficiently rational to recognize only a limited right against others. It was only this limited right that they transferred to the sovereign majority, and it's trusted in a social contract. The government's extension was conditional upon its staying true to its role in protecting the rights of individuals to live liberty and have their own rights and freedoms. Okay, finally, this is a long lecture. I know it's not easy again to see things in e-learning, but I hope this bunch of information like direct your thinking in a certain way. Thanks for joining me in this. Please be safe and always remember things are exactly how you want to see it. Thanks. Take care.